If you look across most IT departments, given the adoption of common frameworks, common tool sets, there are things that are pretty consistent across most companies, as you'd expect. However, there's always one element that, no matter what, always varies massively. And as you probably guessed from the title, it's the service request catalogue. Now, I've seen catalogues of all shapes, sizes, quality over the years, particularly a couple of memorable ones. One that had a solitary item, which in effect just contained a singular text box saying, "What do you want?" And another that contained, I think it was close to about 1,000 items. One, it seems, for every possible eventuality that any user could ever raise. Now, I've always said there's absolutely more art than science involved here, probably more so than other service management processes. But where I think a lot of IT departments go wrong is not having a well defined approach to the catalogue design and how you then maintain it. Now, given catalogues are subject to change, it can be very easy to iteratively make changes that can compromise the overall look, feel, and effectiveness of the offering. Whilst there's no magic wand that will instantly resolve all of your ills with your catalogue, there are, I think, about 8 principles that you can adopt that will certainly stand you in good stead. So let's get into them. There's no organisation on the planet where every single user has exactly the same technology needs or requirements, except perhaps those organisations that consist of a singular employee. And yet, a lot of service catalogues I've seen contain request items that are clearly intended for a specific user persona, but are visible to everyone. Now, a lot of companies have recognised this to a degree. It's fairly common to see our internal to IT catalogue that isn't exposed through the end user portal, alongside all of the stuff that your normal IT users can request. Now, that's a start, but I don't think it goes far enough. When you present everyone with the same catalogue structure and the same set of options, it very quickly becomes cluttered, confusing, and hard to navigate. It also increases the likelihood that users are going to raise requests that were never intended for them in the first place. So, a better approach is to design the catalogue around some very clearly defined user personas, supported by some real solid foundational data. Identity, role, organization structure, and group membership should determine what a user can see and what they can request. That way, each persona is presented with a focused, relevant view of IT services, while more technical or sensitive, or frankly irrelevant requests are restricted to the other appropriate groups. Now, the key here is certainly the quality of the foundational data held within your platform. You need enough information to be able to accurately identify and segment your user base along those persona lines. And ideally, that data should be ingested automatically from a system of record. Most commonly, your HR platform, probably via something like Active Directory or Okta as an intermediary. Do this properly, and you're not just improving usability, you're laying the foundations for better automation, better routing, and approvals to be driven by data rather than manual triage. Like me, I bet you've seen a lot of catalogues that grow around technology platforms or internal IT team boundaries. For example, requests relating specifically to perhaps Microsoft Outlook, or hardware, software, network requests, and so on. That might reflect how IT is organised or how IT teams think about what they support and provide, but it rarely reflects how services are consumed and how users think about those services. Now, I think a better structure is to organise the catalogue around the services that IT delivers, rather than the specific technology platforms. Things like identity and access, email and calendars, collaboration and file sharing, business systems, those sort of broader service oriented terms. Behind the scenes, those services might be supported by multiple different technology platforms, but the user experience should always anchor on the service and not the technology. This makes the catalogue way more intuitive, much more stable over time, and far easier to maintain. It also means technology can change without forcing you to consistently rework the catalogue. Analogy time, and this one might not resonate with everyone, but here goes. If any of you have ever had any sort of retail job, then you'll know that the stock room at the back is never laid out the same as the shop floor. Stock rooms may be organised by various different methods, which suppliers distribute the products by shelf life, etc. But it's certainly not laid out in that logical manner that most shoppers are familiar with that allows and helps them to locate those things that they need. Same applies here. Once you've got a service user focused structure, the next step is defining the request items themselves. A common pattern is for requests to mirror technical actions related to specific technical things. Things like create user in system X or add permission in application Y. Again, that might make sense operationally, but it exposes technical complexity to users and tightly couples your catalogue to your current technology stack. Again, users don't think like that. They think more around the outcome or what it is that they're trying to achieve. They may not even be familiar with the specific technology name or platform, and nor should they be. So, a better approach is to design the requests around user intent and outcomes. Requests like manage someone's access, request a new account, manage access to a shared space. The specific application or mailbox, site, role, what have you, can then be captured through structured fields within a form. This keeps the catalogue simple and understandable for users while still giving IT everything it needs to fulfill the request properly. In that example I referenced where an organisation had close to 1,000 items, they'd opted for a singular request item for each specific outcome. If I wanted to add a user to a SharePoint group, there was an item for that. If I wanted to remove a user from a SharePoint group, there was a specific item for that too. If I wanted to add a user to a group in SAP, you've guessed it. That simply resulted in a very, very busy catalogue, hard to navigate, and the user needed to be technically au fait enough to be able to locate the very specific item in order to get the very specific outcome that they needed. Even utilising built-in search capabilities, for add user to group, that had returned tens of items to trawl through. Then, of course, there was the maintenance effort in just maintaining the catalogue, completely exhausting. So, to stop catalogues growing out of control, variation should be handled through data and not through more and more request types. So, instead of separate requests for adding, for removing, for changing access, a singular request that supports all outcomes through simple selection. The same pattern applies to mailboxes, mailing lists, file access, app access, and similar items. This means that it keeps your catalogue, again, nice and compact, makes automation and workflows easier to maintain, improves reporting, and reduces confusion for users who otherwise would be choosing between near identical options. Oh, approvals. Always the biggest source of friction. So many times I've seen approvals just simply added by default, often based on organisational hierarchy rather than genuine control requirements. Things like line manager approval becoming a catch-all, regardless of whether the request involves cost, risk, or a change to a known service. Throughout my career, where I've had line manager responsibilities, I can't recall of a singular occasion where a member of my team has raised a request and the outcome of that line manager approval hasn't simply just been a click through exercise. An imagined governance step almost that provides nothing or simply places accountability in entirely the wrong place. It ultimately creates friction for users, delays fulfillment, and adds admin overhead without materially improving governance. A more effective approach is to apply approvals only where there is a clear reason to do so. Approvals should exist to control spend, manage risk, protect sensitive information, or ensure accountability for a service or an asset. Where none of these conditions apply, approval steps should be avoided, chucked in the bin. Typical scenarios where I think an approval is appropriate, mouthful, requests that incur a cost, new piece of hardware, paid software license, increased cloud capacity, requests that grant access to sensitive information or regulated systems, privilege roles. Requests that would allocate or modify a service owned by perhaps a specific business area. So, for example, shared mailbox, departmental systems, etc. Um, and requests that create or retire accounts, assets, environments. In these cases, approval should be routed to the person or persons who actually owns the budget, the data, or the service, rather than simply defaulting to a generic line manager. Again, I remember an example in a previous organisation whereby, again, line manager would be used for access to a particular SharePoint site. So, in theory, I could log a request, ask for access to the HR SharePoint site, which would probably contain lots of sensitive information. And provided my line manager said OK, access would be granted without any consultation from HR themselves. Just wrong. In any service catalogue, no matter how well designed, there will always be situations where a user cannot easily find the item that they need. When that happens, people will simply follow the path of least resistance and select something that looks close enough, simply to get their issue logged. This behaviour is completely rational, but it does create significant problems for us on the fulfilment side. When users choose the wrong request, automation breaks, routing becomes unreliable, fulfillment teams receive incomplete or misleading information, and reporting becomes distorted. Crucially, it also masks gaps in the catalogue because demand for missing or poorly designed requests is hidden inside unrelated items. For this reason, a well designed catalogue should always include a clearly signposted "can't find what I'm looking for" option. This provides a safe way for users to describe what they need without being forced to misuse an existing request. Where possible, this option should include some form of intelligent redirection, such as analysing what the user has put in that short description or using keywords and suggesting a more appropriate request if one exists. Now, this approach benefits both users and the desk. Users are way more likely to end up on the right request path, reducing delays and rework. At the same time, the service desk gains clear visibility of where the catalogue is failing to meet demand. Requests raised through this route should absolutely and have to be tracked and analysed, specifically to identify where missing services, unclear wording, structural issues in the catalogue exist that need to be addressed. Used properly, this becomes a continuous improvement mechanism rather than what can be perceived as a bit of a dumping ground, helping the catalogue evolve in line with your real user needs. A well designed service catalogue is not just a collection of forms, it's a structured data model that supports how services are delivered, governed, and improved. Every request should have access to key information such as who's requesting it, which service it relates to, what asset does it relate to, or system or data set, who owns that, whether there's a cost or risk, how long access is or entitlement should last for. And this data is what enables automation, fulfillment, routing, approvals, license management, controls, and meaningful reporting. However, this does not mean that the user should be expected to provide all of this information. In many cases, they won't know it. So things like service ownership, cost centres, data classification, support groups, who fulfills what, should all be embedded within the catalogue model and associated to the request item itself. Where appropriate, the system should derive these automatically from the selected service or the request type. And the role of the user is to describe what they need in terms of outcome and context. The role of the catalogue is to translate that into data required for IT to fulfill, govern, and report on the service effectively. Ultimately, we're talking about standard service requests here. So the data we capture or hold associated to the request should absolutely lead us to the point where we can fulfill first time. Think about your experiences with Amazon. Is there ever an occasion whereby you effectively log a request and Amazon needs to come back to you for more information? Of course not. So the last principle, and probably the most important one, a service catalogue is not a one-off project deliverable. It's a product that needs to be actively managed. Demand changes, new systems, services are introduced, old ones are retired, user behaviour evolves, and without ownership and governance, the catalogue will drift into duplication, inconsistency, and confusion. Now, there should always be clear accountability for, and this probably sits with your service request process owner, for reviewing high volume requests, identifying misuse or workarounds, retiring unused items, improving or consolidating similar requests, and as we spoke about, most definitely acting on the can't find what I'm looking for data. This is how the catalogue stays aligned to real demand instead of becoming just a static inventory. So that's all the principles. As I said, I don't think any of them act as a magic wand you can wave over your catalogue and bam, all issues are gone. These principles are the foundations you should be working from whenever you're building a catalogue from scratch, or where you've got a genuine opportunity to reset. Things like an ITSM replatform, a major redesign, or a wider transformation program. And if you're sitting here thinking, that catalogue doesn't look anything like this, don't panic, all is not lost. What I would recommend though is resisting the temptation to just keep making small incremental tweaks in the hope that it gradually gets better. In most cases, that just adds more inconsistency and complexity. Instead, pause the changes and step back. Invest that time and effort into redesigning the catalogue from the ground up, using the right principles, and then reintroduce it cleanly. I know that sounds like a huge amount of work, but it doesn't have to be. A smaller catalogue built on solid foundations and designed to scale is way more effective than a large, over engineered, and poorly structured catalogue that you're constantly having to prop up. Diverting that effort up front will almost always pay for itself later. Simpler fulfillment, better automation, cleaner reporting, and a catalogue that users actually want to engage with. I hope you found that useful. Let me know in the comments and see you next time.